Hello witches, it's Keldon. I hope you're all doing well. I was trying to film a video and I was just getting stuck in my head, so I figured I would go on live and do it because sometimes that's the only way to force myself to just say things and be done with it without getting caught up in perfectionist tendencies. So, what I wanted to talk about today is something that I have talked about many times before. Many other people talk about this a lot. I talked about it a lot in my book, The Crooked Path. It's touched on in my upcoming book. Yes, this is another talk about authenticity and what it means to be traditional. Specifically, there is this idea that I see come up a lot online regarding traditional witchcraft versus traditional witchcraft. Now bear with me, because if you thought that defining traditional witchcraft was hard, defining traditional witchcraft is probably even worse. And a lot of times when people are talking about these things online, like they're not really elaborating on what they mean or giving like concrete personal definitions. And a lot of times because people are just kind of talking mad shit on the internet, and that's really what this is all about. But I think when people are talking about traditional witchcraft, and maybe I should put this in like quotes because it's not a good thing, right? It's not enough to be traditional witchcraft. You have to be traditional witchcraft. So traditional witchcraft. A lot of times when people are talking about this, they are kind of looking at it as like, this is some modern, newfangled BS. Really what they're talking about is any material related to Robert Cochrane, right? Robert Cochrane was doing his thing in the 60s, so therefore it's too modern. It's silly and stupid and doesn't matter. And then there is this other stuff, which is the really old, ancient stuff that nobody can ever really define or point to. So it's this vague concept. Now I want to put it out there right away. Like, there's nothing wrong with using modern concepts, right? And really, like, what is modern? So we also have to take into account, like, how are we defining time here? Because the 1960s is relatively a bit ago. And what it comes down to is, in some people's minds, it seems like there's some point in the timeline where we stop and say everything before this point is authentic and matters, and everything after this point is modern and stupid. Where is that point in time? I think for most people who are following this train of thought or hold this sentiment, it's the 20th century. And I think a lot of that has to do with Gerald Gardner and people's animosity towards Wicca. That Gardner was founding his tradition in the 1940s, 1950s. And so anything before that is what's authentic. And I will say that there is not truth about, that only the things before Gardner are authentic, but in a lot of ways that is how we define traditional witchcraft, is pre-Gardnerian ideas. But that's not, you know what, I'm actually gonna take a step back, because that's not how I define traditional witchcraft. I define it as Gardnerian concepts, not necessarily pre-Gardnerian, but a lot of people do look at it as pre-Gardnerian concepts. So the other thing too is it might be attached to Margaret Murray. So Margaret Murray is writing The Witch Cult in Western Europe, The God of the Witches, 1920s, 1930s. And people look at it as like, okay, well, anything after her is crap, because the witch cult hypothesis is crap. Which actually, I'm gonna make a note. I'm writing this down because we're gonna circle back to that. Um, it's interesting, and I can get really fired up about this, and you can read about it in my upcoming book. But we often, like Margaret Murray's often this like lightning rod, for like, I don't know, hatred, I guess. But it's interesting to note that there were a lot of people before her that were circulating ideas about an ancient witch cult. Um, and a lot of them were men, but they don't really get the wrath that Margaret Murray gets. So I think there's a buttload of misogyny there that really should be addressed. But anyways, okay, so right, so anything before this 20th century is real witchcraft. It's authentic. Um, but whatever people were doing back then, which again we don't really know, um, was also new at one point. Which I know is like this mind-blowing thing, but like just because, like something like, let's say like some thing that somebody was doing in like the 16th century, like that was new at some point. Um, Traditions don't just like exist unchanged, created in a vacuum, whatever. Like they grow and they change. Um, so a good example of this, and something that I find particularly fascinating when we look at this overall sentiment, is in traditional witchcraft, when it comes to magical practice, we're often working within the realm of folk magic. And one of the areas we turn to for inspiration when it comes to folk magic is the cunning folk, who really in the British Isles, England, Scotland, um, Wales, Ireland, like all over that area. These are really the pioneers of folk magic, and it's from their practices that we have a lot of spells, charms, things that we utilize. But if you spend much time looking into the history of the cunning folk, you quickly realize that these are people that used whatever they could get their grubby hands on. Um, I say grubby lovingly, by the way. Um, but they used whatever they could get their hands on, whatever would work for them. They weren't concerned about the aesthetic of something or how authentic it is or how old it was. They're just using whatever they can get and whatever works. Um, so we kind of look to them as these inspirations, but then we're completely ignoring the fact that like they were they were doing the thing that we're like, oh, sick, that's disgusting. Like using modern things, like how dare you? Because if you took, a cunning person from, whatever time period and transplanted them into today, you better believe that they would be using whatever material was at hand. Now, there's a whole conversation to be had about the cunning folk and the differences between what they were doing and witchcraft and whether they would have considered themselves witches. Like that's a whole thing. So take this for what it's worth. But I would think that if they were here today, which also, I mean, there are still cunning people, like, but whatever. I'm talking about this imaginary specific person or these people from a different time period. And he brought him here today. They would use the magic that we have today. Like they would probably incorporate pieces of Wicca, um, because it works, because it's accessible, it's at hand. Um, so tying this together because I hope that this is somewhat coherent. Um, we we tend to look at things that are modern and new as not having much power or magic, um, and I think that that is just stupid. Um, because we're modern people. Like, I hate to break it to you, dude, but you're not some Puritan farmer from colonial Salem. Like, right? Like, this isn't an episode of the TV show Salem. Like, this is real life. This is 2020. Um, and there's a lot of power in, right? In, I talk about this in my upcoming book, this concept of atavastic resurgence, connecting to things from the past, connecting to our folkloric lineage as witches. But but that's about finding inspiration and finding ways of being today. It's not about pretending that we're in some past, doing things that we don't really know if they were happening, right? Like, and that's why I challenge people when they have this sentiment and they're talking about real, authentic traditional witchcraft. What exactly does that mean, and what exactly do you think people were doing? Um, because we just don't know. We have guesses, we have ideas, we have folklore, and we have stories. Um, but there's not this concrete, you know, concrete evidence, I guess. Um, yeah, I'm trying now I'm trying to think back to why what I wanted to circle back to with the cult hypothesis. Um, because I completely forgot. I see I wrote it down. Why did I bring it up? I can't remember. Um, so yeah. Um, I don't know. Maybe we'll just leave it there. If you have thoughts on this, I would love to hear them. Um, but yeah, we're modern people, and it's okay to use modern things in your witchcraft. Um, and that's important because if it doesn't have context to your life, why are you even doing it? Or, like, if you're just doing something because it's old, is that really a good reason? These are the thoughts that keep me up at night. Um, so yeah, okay. Well, let's end it there. This is long enough. At this point, I'm just gonna spiral out with my thoughts. I hope you're all doing well, and I will, um, I will talk to you next time.